Hello, everyone. This is Greg Scorzo, and you're listening to the Coda Publishing Podcast number 5. Today, we are once again doing the art of thinking with Mr. Bradley Tuck. For those of you who don't know, Bradley is a writer, theorist, performance artist, film director, and the creative director of Exploding Appendix magazine. In this second part of our two-part conversation with Bradley, we'll be discussing Bradley's early life, the origins of Exploding Appendix, the difference between transgression and evil, why the good is often more potent when it's shrouded by danger, why sex and violence is no longer taboo, what is offensive in the 21st century, the pressures on females to conform to market demands, why we allow the market to pressure people into doing things we would never allow a person to pressure people to do, how to spot when the demands of activists on the creative industries are too high, when should you blame labor instead of capital, the unexpected virtues of market pressure, and the importance of agency in people who get bullied. When were you born? What's your birth date?
It's the 24th of November, 1982.
Okay, and where were you born? What town?
So I think, the town I grew up was Ilminster. I think the actual hospital was in Yeovil, so that's...
So what was the place or the city or town that you grew up in?
Ilminster is a sort of small town in Somerset, quite rural, quite small in many respects. I mean, small compared to living in a city. I mean, Brighton's quite a small city, actually. Well, it feels quite a small city, but...
Ilminster's smaller.
Yeah.
So were you an only child, or did you have siblings?
I had siblings, yes. Yes. So I'm the oldest, and then I had my sister Martha, who was a couple of years younger than me, but she died when she was 3.
Oh my God.
So she had a brain tumor. So that happened when I was about 3 years old. And then then there was a little bit of a break, and then my parents had another 2 children a bit later. So when I was so my other sister's about 8 years younger than me, and the other sister's 10 years younger than me. So.
Okay, so she passed away when you were 5 years old.
Around that, yeah.
So do you remember any of that, or is it?
Yeah, I do. I mean, we were in and out of hospital quite a bit around that time, and I was staying a lot of the time with my other family members, so aunts and grandparents and stuff.
Do you remember, like, everybody around you feeling a tremendous amount of sadness?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was So I think I didn't realize what was going on exactly because I was quite young at the time myself.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't until she actually passed away that I sort of kind of found out that, because I don't think I even knew at the time that you could die as a child. I don't think I kind of even got that at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a real shock. So we just kind of went into we took a trip to the place where she'd been staying. So there was a hospital, but there's also somewhere that you sort of stayed, or the sort of children stayed. And we went to sort of visit, and then my sort of mum took me away and sort of told me that it happened. And I first thought she was joking, because you know how parents kind of often make kind of inappropriate, or they make jokes as a kid and you don't quite know what's kind of appropriate jokes and not. So I thought for a second that she must have been joking, but no, so she wasn't.
Wow. So do you remember your sister at all? Or do you remember just her passing?
I remember doing, it's hard at that age because you've always got kind of like quite an emote. It's hard to sort of think through what that is, or think through how you remember people at that age.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have memories of her, and I do sort of remember going on holiday with her and things like that.
Mm-hmm. So after she passed, did you become like the center of the family, and did you feel like all the attention was suddenly on you?
I don't know if I remember it like that. Yeah, I don't really know how to process that period, really. I feel like, I think it was quite an emotional thing to go through, and it was quite an emotional thing to go through for my parents.
Yeah.
I mean, my parents would always like mention Martha and sort of tell people, they would tell people about her and things like that. But yeah, I don't know how much emotionally we as a family processed it.
Do you feel like you were raised in a very warm, nurturing family, or was it kind of cold?
I think it was, I don't think it was cold. It was a very loving family. It was kind of a loving family that's, wasn't necessarily emotionally in depth, I guess. So it wasn't cold. It was very loving, but it wasn't necessarily emotionally
expressive
family. Yeah, that's the right word. I don't see my or my immediate family as big, sort of emotionally expressive people.
Right. And so when you were growing up, presumably there was a big gap of time when you didn't have any new siblings. It was just you, right?
So I suppose, between sort of, I suppose, maybe was I about 8 when Chloe was born? Oh, no, wait, Chloe's 8 years younger than me, yeah, so that would make me about 8. And then I was 10 when Poppy was born.
So what was it like having sisters that were so younger than you?
Well, I suppose I took on the sort of the caring role, really.
Mm-hmm.
That was the role that I sort of ended up taking.
So were they like annoying little sisters, or were they more like your little children?
Well, they were more like my little children, I guess. So, well, I mean, if you're like 10 years old or 8 years old even, you're partly sort of helping bring them up a little bit. I mean, maybe not in the same way that your parents would be, but there is a sort of more of a kind of responsible, or you feel a bit more like, responsible or engaged in caring for people.
So you didn't feel like these were your peers that were being born into your family. You felt like these were people you were looking after.
I don't know if I thought that. I definitely didn't think of myself as a parent. So in some sense, you could see us as peers, and there is an element of that. But at the same time, there was also a sort of caring role that came with that as well.
So when you were a young boy, growing up in Ilminster, did you feel like you had parents that really got you and nurtured and understood you, or did you feel like you were kind of quite distinct from them in many ways?
Oh, I mean, they're very much a sort of sporty family. So yeah, I kind of didn't quite fit in. I don't think exactly. I think we'd have sort of different. I would be the kid that would go to the beach and want to read a book. Mm-hmm. My parents would be much more into sort of surfing and being very active. I mean, my parents are really active, and they're still really active today. They really enjoy going for good long walks. My dad does a lot of squash. My mum does swimming teaching. They're very into a lot of activities. Mm-hmm. Whereas, I did swimming a lot, especially as a kid. Sort of growing up, swimming was my main exercise. But I suppose I'm more of an artsy, and maybe I like reading and researching things as well. Mm-hmm. So it's not that I mean, they were very supportive. And so I think if I wanted to do things, they would be very much up for that. But I think we were slightly different in that respect, in some of our interests.
Mm-hmm. So when you went to school, did you get good marks as a kid? Were you a SWAT, as they say?
No, I wasn't. Well, I wasn't very. I don't think I was particularly intellectually gifted. I'm very enthusiastic. I like learning stuff. So I suppose, but I think, I don't know if I'm maybe a little bit dyslexic. I mean, I don't think I'm being diagnosed or anything. I think it's something like that I think I did struggle a bit with, like some of the reading, writing stuff. But I was also somebody that was really enthusiastic and really enjoyed learning stuff, finding out stuff. So I think even though I don't think I'm particularly gifted in that respect, I think I am somebody that really likes exploring and is really drawn to just sort of exploring
ideas.
And exploring ideas, yeah.
And do you remember what some of your hobbies were when you were a child? What sort of things did you do for fun?
Well, I always really liked, especially as a young kid, like telling stories. I mean, I think from quite a young age, I decided I wanted to be an author and an actor, which, in some weird way is kind of true. It's sort of come true to some extent. I mean, I'm not really an actor as such. I'm more of a performer. I do performance and make films. I mean, I suppose I act in some of them, but it's not quite the same. And I suppose if you say an author, well, I write a lot. I write mainly essays rather than stories, although I do make up some stories, and there are some sort of, well, the Cake Tasting Society, which we discussed the other day, is a piece of fiction. I mean, it's less written, but it is a piece of fiction. And there are other scripts that are more in-depth, that are sort of creative pieces, really.
That's interesting. So, in a way, your adult life kind of mirrors what you wanted it to be like when you were a child. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I think it is very accurate, actually. Yeah. Feels like I kind of understood what I wanted as a kid. I mean, you find out more how to fill that out as an adult, but I suppose, I have been filling it out as an adult.
Did you get along with other kids at school, or did you feel kind of separate from them?
I got on at times with kids. I mean, I suppose at times I felt a bit separate. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I did. I mean, I don't really feel like my childhood years were the most exciting years of my life. There's difficulties when you get older because you have different responsibilities and things can go wrong in some ways, in ways that I think I could there was a little bit more stability as a child, but then certainly at certain parts of my life anyway. But it wasn't necessarily, there was a lot of things that I wanted, I think, in my life that I could only sort of find later as an adult.
So did you feel like the kind of town you grew up in and the people around you were sort of boring, or do you think they were quite interesting?
Well, I often did think that I think what I wanted was to be able to do art and theatre. Like, I went back as a sort of late teens, early 20s from being at uni, and I was like, oh, the library hasn't got any interesting books in it. And, I think partly because I've been going to uni and sort of finding out all these new different things, the town looked very boring. Which, I mean, people move there because it's a nice, quiet place with nice hills and countryside. And it is, it's very pretty. But as a kid, that wasn't really what I wanted. I don't think it's as an adult I want it either. But, it's certainly, it's what certain people want, I guess.
So when you were a kid, did you have a vision in your head of like what an exciting place would be?
Well, I had lots of fantasies but I don't think there was so much about what an exciting place would be. But they were, I mean, I made up stories all the time. So I was quite a storyteller. So I think, my cousins and stuff have recollections of me sort of just telling loads of stories on the way home from school and stuff like that.
So when you were a teenager thinking about going to uni, what were you thinking of studying?
I had studied, for my A-levels, I'd done theatre and philosophy. Well, I didn't do philosophy, it was actually religious studies, but there was a large philosophy component. So I kind of contemplated whether to go. So I ended up going and doing theatre. I think that was my sort of forte at the time. It was probably the strongest subject for me. And but I had always also simultaneously kind of liked studying philosophy and wanted to do philosophy. I was kind of interested in it. I went to uni and did theatre.
Which uni was this?
It was in Leicester. It was De Montfort in Leicester.
And this would have been when, 2000, 1999? When would this have
No,
been?
2001.
Okay.
So I went in 2001. I did theatre studies. A lot of it that was like performance art. So in some ways I found that the first year I found that really exciting because I hadn't really come across performance art, and I found it a really good way of sort of doing sort of self-exploration, I think. But it didn't necessarily teach me a lot more in terms of acting, which I suppose could have been a useful thing if I was going to go into acting. So it wasn't going to teach me that. I think by the end, one of the things I suppose that it's a bit of a, it was a bit of a, like, I was really excited to go to uni because there was all these new things that came both in the university and the culture around it that all seemed really new when I first got there. And then things that I thought were really new turned out to be just a different culture that was going on somewhere else. So the performance art had its own sort of conventions to some extent. And it wasn't just that you were going to be sort of barraged with thought-provoking things from everywhere all the time. It was just thought-provoking when you first encountered it. And then, you know, the fact that you had a sort of LGBT, well, it wasn't really now, it was probably an LGBT, LGB scene in Leicester generally you had an LGB scene in Leicester, and it was that seemed kind of new. And then I realized that had its own culture. It wasn't necessarily, it had its own narrowness in certain respects as well.
So wait a minute. So when you grew up, were you under the illusion that you were homosexual or bisexual when in actuality you were heterosexual?
No, I don't think so as a kid growing up, I just felt that my gender didn't really fit. I wouldn't have necessarily knew how to express that. Well, I suppose I kind of understood in my teens that you could get like trans people, but there was very little about that, I guess, at the time. But I just felt that and of course it would have been very sort of, I suppose what you would say, binary kind of notions of trans people at that time that I would have known of. But that was about, I suppose sexuality didn't really cross my mind until I really went to, I mean, obviously at teens, you know, as a teenager, and especially in your late teens, you kind of know that there are different sexualities, but that wasn't really something that I really identified with. I mean, I loved the Rocky Horror Picture Show as a teenager. That was like those big films that kind of really inspired me. And then, so I suppose I was just exploring, but when I went to uni, I kind of explored what my sexuality. But I think I was mainly exploring ways of sort of expressing my own sense of gender, actually. But the gay scene the gay scene seemed much a place where you could feel safe to do that.
So it was less about finding a sexually attractive man that you could play with. It was more about having an environment where you could not have to worry about having to look like a man.
Yeah, I mean that was what attracted me to it, really. I think. I mean, I think I have a relatively fluid sexuality, so I wouldn't say I was completely only attracted to women, but that's my tendency. If I was going to go on a dating site, I'm not going to be looking at men particularly.
So what is it about women that you find attractive, just out of curiosity?
Interesting question. I mean, part of it I never completely know, but there's just something that draws your attention to particular people. I mean, you know, it's like, I don't know how to sort of explain it exactly, but you just sort of find there's something that draws you to certain types of people. But I think I quite like femness, but I also quite like some androgynousness at times as well. I'm probably more into slightly feistier femmes, slightly more, and some androgyny. But I'm less into like straight up like sort of masculine sort of presentation.
You wouldn't fancy a woman who looks exactly like a man?
Not exactly like a man. Maybe like a very androgynous man, or maybe slightly, you know, maybe some mask traits would be sort of fine as well. But like, it depends really.
So
but a lot of the time, I'm especially attracted to sort of more femme and some non-binary people and stuff as well.
So in the noughties, when you were at uni, did you fancy women like Katie Price?
No, not so much. No, not Katie Price. No. So I either think I like either people that are sort of expressive. I like sort of sometimes quite performatively femme people. And then sometimes, I don't know, some people that are less performative than them, I guess, but more geeky. I mean, it's not like, I don't think it's necessarily hard and fast, but I think that's just the general way I sort of understand the direction of my sexuality.
So when did you go from Leicester to Brighton?
Well, I went back home for a year. I worked a lot, and so I was just living with my parents for a bit. And then I sort of saved up a bit of money to pay for my master's. And so then in 2005, I did a master's in philosophy because that's the subject I really wanted to study alongside. I mean, I think that those are the two subjects that I kind of go back to in some respect. I liked philosophy, or I liked studying philosophical topics within A levels because I liked being able to think through sort of deep ideas. And there's always a question about how good philosophy is at doing that. Academic philosophy is at doing that. But I did think there were some quite cool things going on at Sussex. There were some interesting discussions. The first mod, I was going from studying theatre to studying philosophy, so it was a bit intense in some respects, and I just spent a lot of time studying. So I was kind of working quite hard. I also sat in on as many modules as I could, including undergraduate ones, because I just wanted to get a general idea of philosophy as a whole. But I had to do 4 modules. So at the time, there was one that was sort of philosophical topics that just introduced you to a whole range of philosophy. Ended up writing on the dialectic of enlightenment. Adorno and Horkheimer's the dialectic of enlightenment for that. But we did all sorts of things like Kripke and Kripke's, naming and necessity, and some bits of sort of Kantian philosophy and all sorts. And then I also did a sort of, I suppose it was a philosophy of mind module. We had a choice between phenomenology and philosophy of mind, and I probably should have really done phenomenology because it became a subject that I became more interested in. But I was we were actually reading John McDowell's Mind and World, I think it's called.
I remember that one. I had to read that for my graduate studies as well.
So I ended up doing that. But what made that module difficult was that we had loads of cognitive science people sitting in on the module. So not only was I having to try and grapple with quite a lot of complex philosophical stuff, but we also had people from cognitive science asking loads of questions, and that kept confusing me a lot. So that made it a lot harder to just leap into that. But then the second term, I did sort of political and social thought. Oh, actually, political and legal theory, actually, I think it was. Which was actually a lot of liberal theory at the time. And then continental aesthetics, which was mainly phenomenology. So we looked through sort of Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and some other people, I think, in their theory of aesthetics. And then, as for my dissertation, I did something on Husserl and his ethics. Specifically, I sort of was building towards the idea of doing some sort of study of the relationship between Husserl's phenomenology and sort of ethical and political thought, really. So that was the sort of direction I was going in at the time.
And so throughout this period, you were living in Brighton?
Yes, I was living in Brighton, yeah.
So what was it like going from Ulminster to Leicester and then to Brighton?
Well, I don't think I really engaged with Brighton particularly much because I was studying all the time. I think I would go out with like lecturers and other students on a Friday night after philosophy society. But I don't think I was particularly socializing at that point. I think I was socializing with other people on the course. But I don't think I was socializing particularly.
That's interesting. So, when do you feel like you got the first sense that Brighton was really different to Leicester or Alminster in terms of its culture?
Um, well, like I had this sort of almost intellectual theory that it was. Almost intellectually, I thought it was, and there were times when you'd go, especially in summer when you'd have like Pride and stuff, you would get these kind of days where you could tell it was a different kind of culture. I mean, it's not like it. I mean, in some respects, it is just a normal place. Most of the time, most people that I know don't necessarily have the money to go out all the time. So the culture that you feel that you get from Brighton depends on who your friends are. I suppose you're more likely to have interesting friends or creative friends, I should say. Creative friends or people doing something that's slightly more unusual in Brighton.
That's interesting. So, when did you first start writing for magazines and finding a scene of people that would eventually lead you to Exploding Appendix?
Well, that was 2009. Well, probably 2008. I found Brighton Filmmakers, the Brighton Filmmakers Coalition, which was at the time was like a group of people that wanted to make films. You know, amongst them was Daniel Fawcett, who I don't think he'd actually set up. So someone had probably come and set up the group, but sort of Dan had kind of taken over it and turned it into a kind of a really exciting thing at that time. So I think he'd just moved from Colchester. And he really turned Exploding Appendix into, not Exploding, so he turned the Brighton Filmmakers Coalition into something really exciting. And there were lots of little film challenges. People were making films all the time, and there was a little community there. And Tim actually said, I remember him and Dan having a discussion about making a newsletter for the coalition, which I think Dan just had the idea that, oh, this would be a great opportunity to make a magazine. So they probably had slightly different ideas about what was going to be kind of produced. And then Dan sort of was quite good at sort of getting us all together to start creating this magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a number of sort of things happened, and there ended up only being about three of us in the end kind of editing it. So that was myself, Dan, and James.
Right.
James Marcus. So we edited that for we edited that. Some other people came on board at different points, but it really became a really exciting. I personally really loved writing for it. It was just a way of creating a kind of platform where I could actually experiment with writing. I could use some of that sort of philosophy background that I had, mix it with some of my sort of theory, film interests and theatre, and try and produce something.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really what sort of drew me to start writing.
Okay. And what was it about this scene that you found particularly exciting that differentiated it from, say, just a regular film magazine?
Well, personally, I had the opportunity to shape it in any way I wanted. So if I started to get into something, which is why, it wasn't particularly as Zizek, like we talked the last session about Zizek,
Mm-hmm.
I started to get into Zizek. I shared some Zizek's ideas with James Marcus Tucker. We sort of read a lot of different critical theorists at the time, like, we were reading Adieu and other people like that, Mark Fisher, and sometimes quite eclectic different people as well. But yeah, there was loads of different ideas, I think, just sort of circulating. So it was quite I think it became quite a philosophical venture.
Mm-hmm.
And then it would also mix that with actual filmmaking. So there was an idea that people around us were actually making films. I don't think I specifically made films. There's a few films that Dan and Clara kind of got involved at a certain point. Dan and Clara made some films around that time, and I was in some of them. But in any, I don't think that was anything really sort of strict.
So, did this group of filmmakers in this magazine, in your opinion, have a politics, or was it more open about politics?
I suppose, there was a definitely left lean. It was definitely left, sometimes quite a strong leftist magazine, I guess. But it was a real flexibility with that as well, I think. We were exploring, and I think sometimes it's really great when you can just explore. And sometimes I would write, I think especially later, I would try to write these pieces where I would drift from one person to the next who wouldn't necessarily expect me to, because that's something that Zizek was also doing as well, right? So you say, Zizek would have this bit where he'd go, he's not necessarily on our side, but there's something that they're getting right here. And then we'd talk about some sort of conservative writer or someone else.
Yeah, he seemed to like Francis Fukuyama, I remember.
Yeah.
He wrote about the end of history.
Yeah, well, he often engaged with Francis Fukuyama. I think Sloterdijk as well, if I get the name right. Peter Sloterdijk. But yeah.
So when the magazine 1+1 came to an end in 2013 and 2014, and the people from it started doing these little splinter projects, one of which was Culturally Offensive, another of which was Exploding Appendix, which was your baby. Yeah. What was Exploding Appendix to you as distinct from 1+1? How was it different?
Well, I mean, what it has become, or what it, because at the time, I think my ideas for it sort of have grown. At the time, I think it was partly a way of housing 1+1. I don't think it was going to be strictly about film. It was definitely going to be able to go off on some of the other avenues that I wanted to, that kind of I was interested in exploring, but didn't think were ones that I didn't feel like I was able to strictly, because it was about film, the previous. Whereas this one was the idea it was going to be much more about culture in a much more general sense. And culture, by culture, I mean it could also include history and politics, and as well as art and music and literature. Expansive conception of culture. So that was really the earliest thoughts about it. And then when we went to do the launch party, I decided that we should do it on the future of the avant-garde. Partly because that was a way of linking a load of interests, because on the one hand, there's the whole history of the link between the avant-garde and radical politics. There's a link between the avant-garde, interesting aesthetic work, challenging aesthetic work. So I thought that's the kind of term that kind of encompasses a lot of my interests in some respect. And then after that, that kind of sort of stuck as a way of thinking about Exploding Appendix. And so, first of all, we did one or two events the first year. I was mainly putting up a few videos, I sort of got into doing a few podcasts. So the sort of videos podcast the first year, and then a few events really, and maybe one or two articles or something. It was more of it wasn't particularly formed into anything in 2017 really. And then 2018, I was doing some writing, but feeling like I was just putting some stuff on the blog, and I felt like I really would like to work with some other people. There had been other people involved beforehand, but I really wanted to sort of make it into something like a project. And so I set up what became the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group, which I chose that line partly because it has allusions to the way that in the Soviet period, they would have long acronyms for everything. So I set that up, and that would meet. First of all, I played around with how often we would meet. Eventually, it turned into like every 2 weeks. And at the same time, I was making a film. So I made the Cake Tasting Society whilst running that, which I just became really, really busy for like that year, because I was also doing writing projects at the same time and loads of other stuff.
Right. So
the first half of 2018 was a bit of a dawdle, and then suddenly I sort of amped up and loads of stuff started happening. And then the film, we finished shooting the film in 2018 mostly. And then 2019, I was sort of able to get an idea of sort of running the meetups. And gradually I've kind of come up with I've come up with much more of a sense that we have these meetings. Partly it's been really great to do them online since 2019. Not 2009, since the 2020 when the pandemic hit. We've online, and it's been one of the good things about doing that has just been that I've been able to interview lots of really interesting people. So yeah, that's the sort of story, I guess. We've gradually sort of turned into something. But I suppose on an intellectual level, it's sort of become a kind of project. The term Exploding Appendix Originally, I think my housemate happened to be talking about her exploding appendix at that particular time, and I suddenly went, that relates, because in my head, appendix was also the back of a book. So the sort of fragmented bits at the back of the book, which don't necessarily all easily relate.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that they might be pushing, sort of growing and growing until they sort of explode was sort of, and the idea of explosion also had a sort of almost avant-gardist kind of feel to it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of the later sort of definitions I've sort of come up with, is also a bit like appendicitis, where you have something which seems on the surface useless, which is sometimes how we think about art, but that which is useless suddenly becomes, in a state of appendicitis, becomes potentially dangerous and subversive to the body politic. So in a certain sense, you could see Exploding Appendix also being that transformation of art into something sort of subversive or dangerous, which I think is an interesting metaphor for the avant-garde in some respects, or the history of the avant-garde. I have this sort of fantasy that we produce at some point a book called Encyclopedia Appendicitis, which would be a complete, or maybe multiple volumes, which are like an appendix, lots of fragmented ideas, but because the whole history of the avant-garde, and I think we don't often think about this, is the idea when the first term, the term avant-garde is first used by Saint-Simon, and it's really to describe the idea that the artists, the scientists, and the industrialists will create a new sort of society, but the artists are going to be out front, sort of stirring the hearts and minds of the people. And of course, that's already a kind of reference back both to the kind of culture of the French Revolution. You have sort of Jacques-Louis David, who sort of is a kind of like an avant-gardist, if you think about it, in the way that he's creating art for the revolution. But also in the way that Diderot and the encyclopedists are, intellectually kind of creating the foundations for a new culture in France. And how do they do that? Well, they do that by creating an encyclopedia. And at the end of the essay by Saint-Simon, he says, what we need is to create a new encyclopedia. And then in the Russian Revolution, Alexander Bogdanov, he's wanting to create a proletarian culture. What he's imagining is that the workers themselves will start creating their own encyclopedia, much like Diderot did where Diderot created an encyclopedia for the bourgeois revolution, the workers will create an encyclopedia for the proletarian revolution. That never happens. That book never materializes. But I love this idea that with each revolution, you always have to create a new encyclopedia to sort of create a new Weltanschauung. I mean, we're not at that point yet, but what I quite like at the moment is we're trying to create the dossier, the Exploding Appendix dossier, which is like our online magazine, which is usually exploring a couple words. So the last one was Revolution Art Manifesto. The one we're working on at the moment is Reason, Subversion. And so gradually we're almost creating a sort of our own kind of worldview through doing that.
Now, do you have difficulty when you say we're creating our own worldview? Do you have difficulty with different parts of Exploding Appendix wanting to go in different directions with regards to that worldview?
No, because I think what I quite like, that's where appendism comes in, because appendism allows, because an appendix is fragmented, it doesn't always cohere, and that sort of allows for us to go in different directions. So if you think about appendism in that regard, it allows for a certain amount of fragmentation.
So would you be okay with somebody in Exploding Appendix going much more to the left than you or much more to the right than you?
It's a really interesting balancing act, because I'm sure there are people that have people do have different views, and in the sessions there is a relative amount of either with the people that come or the people we get in as speakers that have slightly different views. At the same time, you don't want it to go to the point where, if you're working on a project, that you want something to keep it together. So you don't want it to be completely, it's like the back of a book. There can be things going in different directions, but it has to still remain in some respects part of the book.
Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't be just a complete free-for-all, because I think you would lose something of the project in that regard. So it has to be sort of directed in some respects. And so there certainly would be political perspectives that I would just think weren't really compatible. It's a bit like you create your own spectrum,
mm-hmm.
which a lot of different, like even the BBC, like it often tries to present itself as neutral. I think it often it's much more, I would see it more as creating its own spectrum, which is sort of different positions across the political spectrum that seem to match the BBC's kind of set of views. It doesn't create one view, it allows for a certain spectrum to be created. And the same would be with Exploding Appendix. We kind of allow for a certain kind of spectrum, which could include different political views, but not every political view.
So would you be okay with somebody, say, writing something like The Radical Legacy of Margaret Thatcher?
Well, I don't personally, that's an interesting one. I think it depends what was written. I don't think Thatcher was radical in what she actually did, but I do think there's an interesting thing to be grappled with, not so much with Thatcher, but with someone like Ayn Rand,
mm-hmm.
who I think actually has a weird critique of capitalism going on in her work, even though it's obviously in favour of capitalism. So I think I suppose for me, there's ways of drawing from these kind of people, like Ayn Rand, Jonathan Swift, he's a conservative, but he's also, A Modest Proposal can be read in quite a socialist kind of way.
Yeah.
I don't agree with him, but Daniel Bell had this phrase, which was, he was conservative in culture, liberal in politics, and socialist in economics.
Mm-hmm.
I don't agree. That's not my position exactly, but I can sort of understand that position in some respects, because the bit that seems most appealing about conservatism is kind of a cultural thing. It's like, how do you preserve certain traditions? And in liberalism, I don't particularly I don't think I have a particular liberal way of viewing freedom,
mm-hmm.
but freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and these kind of values seem to be kind of quite important, certain notions of rights. It comes from a liberal tradition. They have something that we can draw on, I think. And I mean, when Daniel Bell and a lot of people talk about socialism, I think they mean kind of welfarism, mm-hmm. Which I have some issues with, but I think there is something about, there is something going on there as well. Like, I think I would probably want to push it to a much more conventionally socialist kind of direction, which would include something more like the democratization of the economy rather than simply.
Okay.
We live in a world where everything is going. Once the production process rises, once democracy rises against the ends of mankind, once the universal values corruption, peace, and instability to the human experience, completely subjugated to by the procreations, editorial.
What would you say if somebody in Exploding Appendix wanted to write The Radical Masculinity of Mr. T?
Well, the thing is we can say these phrases and it's about what they're actually saying in the piece. Like, I'm not into a particular kind of writing which says, or particular kind of cultural policing which only looks at the phrases that people use. I want to see what they're actually trying to say in that. I don't,
okay.
There is going to be a bias in favour of some of the views that I actually hold.
Right.
And I am going to sort of say, well, I just might think this is wrong. Sometimes I might think this is wrong, but it's insightful and it's worth engaging with. Sometimes it might be something that I think is wrong, but worth debating, which might be a slightly different thing than just putting it up in the, let's post this as if we agree with it. So there's different, I think there's room for something like that to happen. I'm quite happy to have discussions. I think that can be quite useful sometimes,
mm-hmm.
discussion debates. But it really just depends. But I'm not going to just present things just because. I think that you have to have something that unifies the project as a whole. And some of that will be the viewpoints.
So suppose someone were to write a piece about how Mr. T was a very positive, liberating role model for men because he wore gold chains, he had a lot of muscle, he spoke rather loudly and with vulgar language, and he was very demonstrative, and he didn't take no for an answer. And if more men were like this now, a lot of the gender relations between men and women would disappear because women would see men in security-oriented or security-bringing light. They would feel safer around men if more men behaved like Mr. T. Would you allow that to be published in Exploding Appendix?
At the moment, it doesn't quite feel like an Exploding Appendix piece. I probably would have to read all the details. There might be something in it that I actually think, oh, this might actually, or this might have made me think about something, or it might have persuaded me about something. But from the surface of it, I don't feel like it's, on the surface, sounds like an Exploding Appendix. Maybe.
Well, what if the title of it was Pitying the Fool, Why Feminine Men Need to Step Their Game Up?
Although I do think this could be quite, I mean, potentially it could sound like an ironic critique of me, right?
Well, what if it was basically saying that men like you should be more like Mr. T, and you'd be happier?
Well, I think this is possibly more interesting as a debate.
Okay.
than something that we necessarily put up as a piece. In all likelihood, unless it's got something that I really think, oh, actually, I disagree with it, but it's insightful.
Well, what if the person who wrote it was a leftist who thought if more men were Mr. T, or like Mr. T, there would be a greater chance of having a communist revolution? And that's why this person thought Mr. T was radical.
That might start being really interesting then, yeah. I think it would have to have something that would allow me to go and think, oh, this is worth publishing even if I disagree with it.
Interesting. So it would have to sort of tie back in with some of the core value of Exploding Appendix.
Yeah.
Even if it was saying people like you would be more politically emancipatory if you're more like Mr. T. Interesting. Okay, so you're open to things that have bits in them that you don't like, provided there's other bits in them that you think are interesting.
Well, yeah, I think, if it's completely, I think that, I mean, I don't know how you think about this, but there's got to be something that you kind of want to agree with at some level the piece in order to find it interesting. Now, we have quite different people as guests for Exploding Appendix, but I think at some level I find them all insightful. I think they're all saying something that I, at some level, agree with, not all levels, but some levels.
What if someone wrote a piece called Solving the Problem of Rape Culture, Why More Men Should Get Chemical Castration?
Again, I think, so chemical castration, and can you just tell me a bit more?
Well, suppose the paper or the article was arguing that we would solve the problem of women feeling frightened or threatened by masculinity if more men would voluntarily choose to undergo medical procedures that would render them sterile and not physically attracted to women, or anyone for that matter.
Yeah, I feel like the level of intervention on someone else's autonomy is quite extreme in that kind of context. So I probably am unlikely to want to publish that.
So is that a case of the article going against your moral compass, or is that a case of the article just not fitting with the political brief of Exploding Appendix?
Well, I might be interested in that in a very, well, it does go against, because I don't really want to chemically castrate anyone.
Well, it would be encouraging men to chemically castrate themselves for the greater good of making women feel comfortable.
So so are they actually making the choice themselves?
Yeah, but it's encouraging men. Like, it's saying if you're one of the people who doesn't need sex, really you should just get rid of it because you'll make women feel more comfortable.
But in all likelihood, it probably wouldn't go in. I don't think it would be going in.
Is that for moral reasons, or is that because it doesn't satisfy the political brief of Exploding Appendix?
Well, it would. It's just. I think it also just maybe both or either, depending on what was actually said in the article, how serious it was probably being, what it was actually saying, or how. I mean, there's possibly things that we could, in theory, put in. We really absolutely disagree with, but would put in because you'd want to discuss it. But that would have to be put in within a particular context. So if you wanted to put something that was really, the Mr. T thing seems kind of more like which icons we should hold up or not. Whereas the second one seems like it.
What if somebody wrote, embracing your inner nonce, why pedophiles are good for labor unions?
Well, probably not. I think there's an interesting, sometimes I think that some of these topics, as hard as they are to deal with, we do need to find ways to complexly think about some of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily paedophilia in labour unions, because I don't think that's a particularly good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there are difficult topics that sometimes need to be thought about, which might be things like sex offender registries, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Are they a bad thing? That would be a thing that you might consider either having a debate about or having maybe quite a controversial article in if you decided to put that in. But yeah, it's a bit like a balancing act. You read something, you think, is this something that we would want to be putting out? I think there's a certain difference between what you put out as this is something that we're generally sympathetic to.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that we're willing to have a debate about, which is that you can frame them in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some things which we might not want to put out because we agree with it, maybe we completely disagree with it, but we think that it's something to be critically engaged with.
How about something like the joys of suicide, kill yourself, fight the rich?
I'm highly suspicious that any of these things are going to necessarily get in. But they're just, in all likelihood, I'm kind of being quite charitable at the second, but they're not going to get in, I don't think.
Would that not get in for moral reasons or because it wouldn't satisfy the Exploding Appendix brief?
I think there's a blurred line between the two, right? Like a lot of these, I think they're moral reasons. But there might be a case in which a lot of these sound like they're moral reasons because they just seem like things that we wouldn't want to defend. But there are also things that probably don't fit with our brief either. No.
Well, what's interesting is even though they don't fit, they seem like they're quite sort of politically in the same ballpark as you, and they're also quite revolutionary, avant-garde type pieces of writing because no one else is saying these things, right? No,
it's true. It's not all about what people are. I like the avant-garde as a way of unifying, but transgression isn't good for its own sake, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just about having a transgressive website.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's about challenging people, but I think there is some sort of relationship between the good. So it is almost, there is an ambition behind it. I do think there is something like we are moving towards thinking about what kind of society we would want to live in. It's just that society probably does include a lot of artistic and intellectual freedom. And also, I also tend to think persuasion is at least one strategy, that society. So you can allow for some differences of opinion within that, and sometimes maybe even incendiary.
But there's a limit to how incendiary you want to go.
Well, yeah, there's probably more room if it's a debate for being incendiary.
What about a piece called Fuck Her Ass, why rape is better than porn?
Yeah, I think this is all pretty much not going to go in.
Are you sure, Bradley?
Yes.
Okay, so it's avant-garde, it's leftist, it's incendiary, it's unusual. People don't say these sorts of things. It's shocking, but it's still going to get a no from Bradley.
Yes. I'm not going to put every single thing in, especially things that I think are really bad in their politics.
So it sounds like there's a range of things that might be subversive, they might be controversial, they might be shocking, they might be leftist, they might be clever, but they're still evil. And because they're evil, they're not going to get an exploding appendix.
Yes, I mean, I'm pretty sure that's. Well, I'm like, I mean, there's an interesting debate to be had around someone like Stalin, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not going to just put up any old defense of Stalin on the page.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's lots of things that I think Stalin did that were pretty awful. Just because he's a leftist doesn't really mean that he's going up. I mean, as I said, that there could be a kind of critical engagement with his work that I might not agree with, that I might think would be worth putting up. But that's a slightly different thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It would fit the, I don't want to necessarily turn him into. I think it's quite useful to try and understand and critically engage with what he actually thought and the development of his thought.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to sort of also turn anyone into a particularly. It's quite useful to understand all people's thoughts and even the nuances in their thoughts, even if you disagree with them. But yes, I'm not going to put up anything. Well, and I'm sure that the other people on the team, on the editorial team, would actually kind of challenge me if I started putting up some of these things.
So you wouldn't put up something like serial killers, unsung heroes of the revolution.
Well, how ironic are these being? I mean, that's a kind of question.
No, they were not. If these were not ironic, they would definitely get a no. Because although they're subversive and leftist and clever, they also happen to be evil. Right? Isn't that the biggest rule of Exploding Appendix? No evil?
I don't know if the word evil is the exact thing, but it's something along those lines, yeah.
So if evil is sort of the biggest deal breaker that'll get you rejected, why don't you bring evil into the content description rather than just talking about subversiveness and kind of things which sound like they could be inviting evil people into Exploding Appendix?
Well, like, we make a judgment, so I mean, it's actually not always easy to know what's going to be evil in terms of submissions. So I'd much rather, if we're talking about submissions, people send us evil things and we can decide we don't want them, because we don't rarely get things that are evil. And people that say that they don't want evil, like, most people don't think of themselves as evil. They think they're doing something particularly good.
Yeah, but do you worry that if you promote yourself as being a magazine or a collective that will go against social norms, and that's what your sort of biggest drawing in selling point is, as it were, you will attract evil people?
I don't necessarily say that we would always go against social norms.
Okay.
Plenty of social norms that we would. I suppose avant-garde to me doesn't just simply mean going against social norms. I mean, there are moments within the avant-garde where people do go against social norms.
Yeah.
Or they do, in the sense that aesthetically abstract paintings, or, a painting that's just black, was at one point going against some kind of social norm, I suppose.
But you do feel very strongly that something, no matter how avant-garde and leftist and even clever and well-written, is still absolutely unacceptable in Exploding Appendix if it's evil.
Well, that's because transgression isn't good for its own sake, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can critique, but also non-transgression is not good for its own sake either. Like, the lack of transgression, just completely conforming to a certain set of social norms, isn't good in itself either.
Mm-hmm. But why is there nothing in Exploding Appendix about, like, rejecting evil?
Because, well, there is, I think. I think there are moments where, in my writings, you see that I'm trying to aspire to some conception of the good.
Okay.
So I think, and that's why, and even concepts of, like, I mean, they're sort of normative, like, we're doing a section the next dossier is going to be on reason subversion.
Right.
And you could say, well, reason, you could say, is about rejecting social norms, which historically it has been.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a concept of reason, which is about what kind of reasons should we have for accepting good ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at Diderot's famous piece where he says, I can't remember the quote, but we used the quote in the call for submissions, where he says, basically we're going to strip down anything that's sort of not based on reason, or strip away customs and traditions that aren't based on reason. But it seems that the reason you're stripping them away is because you have some conception of the good that guides that. So it's not just about transgression for its own sake.
So again, why is these things that are core to Exploding Appendix, like the good, social virtues, avoiding evil, why are these sort of less prominent in the advertising of Exploding Appendix as opposed to the things that relate to transgression being more prominent?
I think partly because, I think this is, Lars von Trier said something, or at least I've seen a quote that I think is attributed to Lars von Trier, which is about, the evil is often more aesthetically interesting, or at least you could say transgression is often more aesthetically interesting. And I think there's a combination of both going on. So I think the good is in there. And I think if you look at any of my writings, I think there are attempts to kind of explore what the good might be. But there is also a kind of, what you might call a kind of aesthetic violence that comes with that as well. Because it's not like these are just polar opposites. The two things are often entwined, right? The good and evil.
So is there something kind of satisfying about writing something that's supposed to be for the good, but making it look sort of naughty, like it's for evil?
Well, yeah, I think that has often had a power.
But it's not really evil. True evil would get kicked out of Exploding Appendix.
Yeah. Well, yes. I think that there's only so much. Like, if I think it's genuinely evil, it's probably not going to be going into Exploding Appendix. Unless I think it's really important to understand this evil, and therefore we need to actually study it.
What would you say to somebody who says, well, I saw Exploding Appendix, it said culture with guts on the marquee, there was a picture of a bloody organ on it, it looks like it's really going for controversial material, but I got rejected because the editor said I was evil, but this is advertising to people like me.
Yeah, well, it doesn't tend to. I don't think people tend to just simply send us evil stuff. Due course of submissions we don't get.
So you think when people look at it, they know that the kind of the violent imagery and the kind of associations with naughtiness and social transgression, that those are really more performance-y elements of Exploding Appendix, that they're not really indicative of an organization that would like to publish a piece like The Joy of Suicide?
Yeah, I haven't had The Joy of Suicide. I haven't had The Joy of Suicide, but I haven't had a piece like that.
This is fascinating to me because it sounds like Exploding Appendix is sort of quite a moralistic organization, even though it sort of masks itself in things that might be interpreted as antisocial, even though they aren't.
Well, the problem with moralism is it often turns into this kind of finger-wagging, paternalistic, I think it often becomes a barrier to the good, ironically. Mm-hmm. Because it often becomes a more oppressive thing, and the best way to try and get to the good is sometimes that requires an element of openness and play, which is much closer to looking like something dangerous.
But it's only a performance, though. It's not really dangerous, right?
On the one hand, there are things that are dangerous that bring about good things as well. That's the other thing.
Oh, so they aren't okay if they're dangerous, provided that the danger brings about a greater good?
No, I didn't say exactly like that, but there are. I don't think it's always easy to make a distinction. Mm-hmm.
is there something about an article which, let's say, gets published in a philosophy journal using very dry language, which is arguing for the greater good, whereas if it gets published in Exploding Appendix and it's got images of sexuality and violence and it's got swearing in it, that makes it somehow more potent than the philosophy journal version of it. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I think that does.
So what is it about surrounding the good and evil, or surrounding the good in danger and transgression, let's say, that makes the good more potent than if you surround the goodness in formality?
One, I think it allows for, I think one of the things that's important to do is create an environment where certain forms of not even where the good has some room for vagueness.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you completely know what the good is, then you can't really allow people to get to it. So part of the process of getting to the good requires a process of development. And that process of development, sometimes I think it's just quite good to be able to have a sort of almost playful approach to getting to that. Because you don't want a strict definition of the good that doesn't allow the play and experimentation that brings about the good.
Okay. So would you say that something like John Rawls's Theory of Justice would be a much more effective book for the good if it were told, or if it were enunciated in the format of like a comic book with lots of horror movie imagery and blood and surrealism, as opposed to a philosophy book?
Not necessarily. It might be more persuasive. I mean, it might inspire people in a way that, I don't ever feel like I personally found John Rawls' Theory of Justice that inspiring,
Mm-hmm.
because it kind of bored me.
Yeah, would you find it more inspiring if it was in like a horror movie comic?
Yeah, I would.
Why do you think that is? Why is it that surrounding virtue and goodness in darkness is somehow making the goodness more potent?
Because in a way, maybe this is something to do with human nature, but I think there's something about the way we kind of conceptualize evil that reveals something about the good.
Interesting. And is this why evil is most effective when it's appearing like it's totally good on the other side of the spectrum?
Yeah, I guess so.
So if evil wears good-looking clothes, it's quite effective. If the good wears dirty clothes, it's quite effective.
There is something like that. But I also think because there is something good in transgressions of certain kinds, not all kinds, but the sort of strictures of society that are supposedly put in place for the good can end up being quite repressive, right? And so what in those contexts, the images of evil are actually expressions of the good. They're just evil from a particular perspective.
Yeah, it's fascinating how human beings tend to like things that are supposedly good when they're surrounded with danger and evil.
It's true.
Or at least surrounded by iconography which reminds them of danger and evil.
Yeah.
Whether it's like the rock star band that seems a bit sexually aggressive and naughty in the 60s, like the Rolling Stones, or whether it's sort of horror comic books for children, like the EC comics of the 1950s. Those things are all retrospectively remembered as quite positive aesthetic things, which in their own way contributed to the good.
Yeah.
That's why they're considered classics. But at the time, they were quite controversial and also quite appealing because they dressed their aesthetic virtues in a shroud of danger and potential antisocial causing behavior.
Yeah.
So what's fascinating also is what's considered antisocial in the 50s and 60s is very different to what's considered antisocial today.
Mm-hmm.
We're so saturated by sex and violence that sex and violence almost don't even have the sheen of danger unless they're really evil examples of sex and violence. But just showing people, for instance, movies of people getting blown up or lots of sex, there's almost nothing today that really makes people bristle about those things. I mean, even people who don't like them just don't watch them. They don't get offended by them, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So the question becomes, okay, what is sort of something that creates a sense of danger today? What do people find evil today? that you could wrap around something good to make the goodness of it more potent?
Interesting question. But I feel like almost discussion sort of almost feels like evil.
Is evil today related to anything that's not politically correct? Is that more frightening to people than sex and violence?
But if you could have a depoliticized notion of what political correctness is, whereby the right might have their own version of political correctness, and liberals might have their own version of political correctness, and leftists might have their own version of political correctness, then that might work. But it's more the discussion, or it's more the idea of some kind of social engagement where we start to work out ideas together.
So that's interesting. So kind of having a discussion where there are forbidden perspectives in the discussion, that frightens people more than kind of blood and sex everywhere, right?
At least in comparison to the 60s, yeah. I mean, it feels like there's a lot more. In the 60s, you get, I mean, there are quite interesting discussions and debates going on in that period. But it seems like, I mean, in some ways, that was also the transgressive element, but quite an exciting transgressive element in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
So the shared ideas that are being developed and explored.
But I mean, if you think of the social norms today, what are people most frightened of from their fellow humans? Is it being murdered by them? Is it being raped by them? Or is it something else?
Well, it's also, there's a sense of, just a general sense of uncertainty, I think, which permeates. So people are looking for certain certainties, which regardless of what position they have. And I think partly because we're in a time of change, right? Something is changing, and you've just got, different viewpoints, or people latch on to their different viewpoints more than would in a time where they aren't where the future seems stable.
So do you think then that if you put, for instance, posters up on lampposts of blood and sex, that would be less controversial than putting up debating society posters on lampposts?
Well, it does depend on what you're putting up to some extent. Like, there are still things that you could put up that were sexual that would be really offensive.
That's true.
And in certain context, if you're putting them up on lampposts, certainly there would be things that would be really offended.
Yeah.
Including quite like graphic nudity might just be enough.
But would it be offensive because people are threatened by that image, or would it be offensive just because they think it's inappropriate to put that image here?
Yeah. I mean, pretty much you can see it if you want to, you can see quite graphic images anywhere.
So what would be an image that people wouldn't want to see anywhere?
Well, there are certain forms of violence, especially real violence, I think, that a lot of people don't want to see, even though they could, I think, quite easily.
I suppose that's true. So anything that would advocate blatant, horrible, violent behavior in a very unambiguous way would be a forbidden image.
Yeah.
So is it things that seem to be advocating immoral behavior rather than sex and violence imagery per se that today you think are most distressing to people?
Maybe. I think it's more about a sense that people haven't got stability.
Mm-hmm.
So if you feel a bit uncertain, then you kind of tend to act out at some level, and I think that's happening. I think that's actually generally happening from a range of different viewpoints. There's a certain sense of a lack of certainty about a lack of stability about where society's going. So if you can then at least hold on to a particular viewpoint or a particular thing, which, it might turn out to be the right thing. But there is a certain association with those viewpoint, with a viewpoint as something that would offer comfort, especially community around it would offer comfort.
I can think of an example of something that when I was growing up would have been considered strange, kooky, and transgressive, which today would be considered absolutely awful to put on a lamppost. A picture of a gay couple with a circle around them and a line through it with a sign under it that said "No homo." If you put that up in, say, 1989, that would be considered a very strange, weird sort of thing. Because the assumption was, well, people don't really talk about gay people and they don't really feel that comfortable even having a discussion about it.
Yeah.
Whereas now, if you put the no homo poster up, it would be considered basically an act of hate speech. Whereas in 1989, for instance, if you put a still up from Friday the 13th when Jason Voorhees stabs a woman with a carving knife, and you put that on a lamppost, that would be considered really horrible, antisocial, potentially youth-corrupting behavior. Whereas now it would just be like, oh, somebody's into horror movies and they put that on a lamppost.
Yeah, maybe there is some shift in what we would see as acceptable. I mean, although there was obviously movements at that time, very much engaged with. I mean, it's you sort of emerging sort of AIDS epidemic and stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, even in the previous decade, an artist we know called Steve Binion, he did a lot of work in a project called Homocult, where he was putting things up that at that time were considered maybe more controversial than they would be today in some respects, but in other respects less controversial than they would be today, depending on the image. Right?
Well, yeah, I mean that's a lot. There's a lot of art. There was another group called there's a lot of art that comes out of sort of around that period that sort of seems to be like there was a lot of act up sort of artwork that sort of is collages and sort of stuff like that. It's very provocative, I think. And Steve Binion's work, or Homocult's work, I should say, is very provocative. I mean, it would be sort of provocative in a different way than it is today. And like this is like Yasmin Nair came on our podcast, and she was talking about how she refuses to change her old articles, and she was talking about this and how she also, if Against Equality publishes anything or republishes anything, they want the original rather than something that's been updated. And part of the reason they want that is because it becomes an archive of that particular time.
Right.
And one of the things that she was mentioning was, of course, what was it called? The North American Man-Boy Association.
Yeah, NAMBLA.
NAMBLA.
I don't think that has ever been uncontroversial. That's always been universally hated.
Yes.
I don't ever remember a time when that was considered like, whatever. It was never a whatever. It's always been a, oh my God.
Yes. And her point is that that's an important thing to grapple with. It's not good to just simply see LGBT movements as being this singular progressive line direction where you get 60s counterculture, then you get kind of the AIDS epidemic, and then you get gay marriage, and then everyone's happy. And so she was like very much criticizing that kind of trajectory. So I think there's a certain thing to be said for, and what I would agree with that is that there's something to be said about actually understanding history and understanding where these movements come from, and even have bad things going on in them.
Well, also understanding that if we're honest, the big obstacle towards assimilation of same-sex relationships into society is not just homophobia, but the association of homosexuality with transgression, some of which has been quite horrible, like the abuse of children.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not that doesn't happen in. I mean, this is partly also wrapped up in sort of homophobia. So you get one of the ways it's being painted, and in some ways that media, and one of the reasons why people want to react against that media is because it almost gets used by opponents of LGBT equality, which then sort of stigmatize it, when actually, even the Catholic Church and other things, which aren't necessarily gay organizations or LGBT organizations, have been abusing children too,
Have you noticed that there's a strange sort of double standard when it comes to consent in the modern world that wasn't there in the old world? When I say old world, I mean like the world prior to 2014. So, for instance, everything is hyper-conscious today about making sure that no woman ever feels pressure to do anything in the bedroom she doesn't want to do, to the point where people even advocate consent midway through sexual acts, like, can I kiss you? Can I touch the back of your head? Can I pet your hair? Can I touch your breasts? And everything has to be yes, 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 yes. Right? On the one hand, there's that. But on the other hand, there's this other thing, which is if the market wants you to have a same-sex encounter and you're trying to have a good career in porn, Well, you better have a same-sex encounter and learn how to like it. Or at least learn how to like it enough to do it and fake that you like it in front of the camera. So it's almost like we're putting all of this pressure on men not to make women do anything they don't want to do. But the market can do all sorts of things to women, and it's fine.
Well, yeah, I mean, well, there's what the market wants to do and what we might in a kind of moral context want to do might be quite different, and they can conflict.
But we give the market all sorts of powers we don't give men. And I don't remember us doing that until very recently.
We've always, the market has often had a role. I mean, I suppose there's certain times where the market's been more or less regulated. In a sort of market capitalist context. So if we're talking about the 19th and then 20th century, there's different points of regulation, and obviously different in different countries. And there's different moral values that didn't always line up with the market. And at certain points, some of those have been ways of which the market has been regulated. And that you might question whether they're the same moral values, but there's certainly been moral values throughout that have often been alongside that.
Well, do you think it's interesting that in the last 5 years, there are a lot of things which are paralleling this hyper consciousness and sensitivity about consent, where it feels like we're giving the market an ability to almost force women to do things they don't want to do if they choose to be in certain sectors of those markets competing?
Interesting point. But I mean, it's a bit like any job, actually. There's a certain sense that there's certain expectations. There's all threat of losing your job if you don't do X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, imagine we would be aghast at a husband who said, well, once my wife turns 50, she better get shit in her face. Because if she's not going to get shit in her face like Botox, there's a good chance I'm going to break up with her. Like, if a man said that, he would be considered absolutely outrageously awful. Yeah. But if the market says that to an actress, it's considered like, well, if you don't want to be part of this, then don't be an actress.
Well, that's one of the problems, I think, in some respects. Well, that's one of the moral questions about the market, right?
It makes you do things that no human being would be seen as decent for pressuring you to do. So whether that's putting shit in your face, whether that's having a same-sex encounter, whether that's all kinds of things.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, it certainly pressures you, and it has always pressured to do things that they didn't want to do, or would even find absolutely horrific things to do.
But what's interesting is the justification normally is, well, you chose to be in this form of market competition. If you don't want to do these things, then don't get in this competition.
At some point, you need to be in, unless you've got money, you can't necessarily refuse. You have to choose some form of work. And a lot of work at some level is shit, or involves some kind of exploitation.
Well, it's a difficult one, because you could say, okay, you've got two choices. You can, if you're a young actress, you can express yourself and be an artist in this field, potentially make huge loads. You can potentially make huge amounts of money, potentially be adored, potentially have everything you've ever wanted in terms of mate selection, a big house, big car, blah, 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 and being able to participate in great works of art. But the downside is you have to look a certain way, and you have to work really hard to look that way, and you have to put shit in your face when you get older if you don't look that way naturally, if you still want to do this. But on the other hand, you can give up all of that and go work in a call center, and you can be as fat as you want, and you don't have to do anything you don't want to do in that regard, in terms of like looking a certain way or being flirty.
I mean, a call center is also a pretty shit job in other ways.
Yeah.
So it's not like the options between one really nice thing, like where you have all sorts of consent and choice, and then one where you don't, or vice versa.
Yeah. Well, you can always critique the actress by saying, well, you could be in theater. Why do you want to be in movies? When you can look all kinds of different ways and be in lovely theater productions. And
well, it's like a bit like when people say, on the one hand, they say, well, you can always go to a different job, but you're always going to have to go to, if that's the choice, sometimes it ends up being you don't get a job, or there's the risk of not getting a job, you have to leave. Or
yeah.
And then the other thing is when you say, well, if you don't like a particular country, you can go somewhere else. But it's a similar kind of thing. You still have to work out ways of getting out of that particular country. Those are all the complications. And then the other country might be shit as well, you know.
Yeah. Well, what do you say to the woman who says, whether it's being an actress, whether it's being in porn or whatever, I don't want to do the things I have to do in virtue of being in this competition, but because I want to be at the top so badly, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. In that case, is the problem the woman or is the problem the industry?
Well, I think you could imagine an industry that's not like that. I mean, you could work out ways of collective organization and ways of I mean, if it's simply the industry, like how do you go on strike effectively from that industry is an interesting question. But I suppose that would be one of the things you'd want to think about potentially if you were that woman.
Well, if you're that woman, you would see anything which is a sacrifice of your ability to be at the top as undesirable. So yeah, you could strike and maybe contribute towards an industry in the future which is less like this, but then you would jeopardize your ability to be at the top now, which is what you want. So if you're not going to strike or complain because your most important value is to be at the top of the movie industry, is that something that you should be criticized for?
In a particular context, you have the choices, you have to make a particular choices that you might feel are good or not. So, you know, we all have to make sort of, unless we're going to completely reorganize the political and social system today, then you're going to have to make some kind of weird compromises, make decisions within that system. You can find ways of collectively organizing to kind of challenge that system, or you know, maybe you say, well, you end up sucking it up. But I guess you know, unless you're going to have some mechanism to change things, then yeah, you do make some kind of sacrifices. We all make some kind of sacrifices within the system.
Well, what if it turns out that the reason the system is the way it is because most people in it want to be at the top way more than they want to change it? Is the responsibility still with the system or is it with those people?
Oh, well, there's certainly a criticism to be had there, I guess. You know, if you're not going to have some sort of solidarity with, there are certainly people that, you look at, say, the HR system and think of themselves as being their friends, rather than thinking, how do we organize against our employer, for example. That is, and there's a certain, I guess you could say, critique of that. But I suppose the way that you persuade someone of that is not to just finger wag. I think you find ways of persuading someone that's in their self-interest, right? Like, there's a really interesting article by a group called, there was a 70s collective called For Ourselves. They wrote a piece called The Right to Be Greedy, which is a kind of leftist sort of manifesto, I guess. A sort of play on it was a play on Paul Lafargue, who was Marx's cousin-in-law, Marx's son-in-law. And he wrote a piece called The Right to Be Lazy. This was a piece called The Right to Be Greedy. And it there's a bit where it talks about, because it's an egoist piece, it's an egoist communist text, it's sort of saying that you inspire people by what's kind of radical in them. So rather than finger wagging or telling people they're doing something morally wrong, you kind of try to inspire them. And that's kind of, and the way that they phrase that kind of process of inspiration is, you know, you're speaking to what's most radical. And by what's most radical, they mean you kind of inspire people by this kind of radical potential of something rather than simply kind of telling them off, which actually I don't think is actually very persuasive at the time. Maybe some people might disagree with me, but I generally don't think.
Well, it does bring up a paradox, which is, what do you do if there's an industry that you're working in? You feel like the conditions under which you're working are degrading. It could be the movie industry, it could be call center, it could be the construction industry, whatever. And you go to other people and you say, let's organize to try and make this a kinder, gentler industry where I don't feel degraded. And those other people are like, well, I don't feel degraded by any of this. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to be at the top. If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. And so there's no solidarity and there's no efforts to organize collectively or change, because most of the people in this industry just want to be at the top, and they don't care, and they think if you don't, get out.
Yeah, whereas then your challenge is then to try and inspire them to do so, or talk about things that maybe frustrate them. That's then the process that you'd be kind of going through.
But is there ever a situation where you would actually side with the people that are trying to be at the top, rather than the person saying, let's change things because I feel vulnerable or I feel degraded or whatever?
We all have to make sort of strange sacrifices within the current situations that we live in. So you can't completely go away and live in your ideal society. You have to somehow work within the one you're in, unless your ideal society just happens to be, a little travel away. But most of the time, that's not the case for most. Most of our ideal societies are, in some sense, imaginary.
You're right. There's an interesting kind of parallel example here. So you could say, if a woman goes into the movie industry and says, why should we all have to have filler on our face when we're in our 50s? Why should we have to work so hard to be beautiful after we're 50 or 60? Lots of people will say, yeah, that's really unfair. Let's organize. Let's, try and change the situation. But suppose the woman goes into the movie industry saying, well, there's a lot of crying scenes. Crying scenes are very emotionally debilitating for me and other people, and they incentivize lots of people not to be actors. So let's try and organize together to ban crying scenes. And then all the actresses say, no, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Would you support most of the actresses wanting to keep the system the same in that context?
I think also, I actually think that there's a certain importance, not so much in crying scenes, generally banning crying scenes, because I think that, but people having the choice to refuse work that includes crying scenes, or refusing, like people should have the right to refuse films where there's sex scenes, for example. They might not want to do that. So there's a certain right to refuse. And you might say that person might just not end up getting any money. And there might wind up being ways you could actually end up critiquing the system. But I think it's what things you fight, I guess, is the question.
But I suppose that I'm getting at is, are there any situations where you actually side with the system and you say, the person trying to change the system is just being too sensitive to something?
Yeah, well, I think, because there are different ways you can organize a society so that, but at some points, it's not an ideal. In no case is it ever completely a case that you can put a completely ideal system in place. You can sort of work through different models, and I think it's really helpful to kind of understand different models of society and try and work out ways in which you can push for certain kind of models that might work and certain systems that might work in certain contexts. And you could try and and build those in.
Mm-hmm.
But what I don't think you can do is expect that there's not going to be, on a sort of very personal level, some kind of sacrifice or some kind of something that's going to go on. But I think any kind of system, there might be some kind of demands of you to do certain things. Even in a kind of anarchist style kind of commune, there's going to be some kind of demands on you to do certain things.
So where do you draw the line between when the demands are actually quite reasonable and when they're not?
I think part of it's discussing, because there's things that for me might seem really unreasonable, and then I actually chat to somebody and I actually think, oh, I get where you're coming from. I can sort of understand it. Whereas, because we all have our own mindset, we sometimes miss actually when something is actually quite genuinely, like for somebody, certain actions might be really traumatizing.
Mm-hmm.
They might be really traumatizing, but for other people, they really might not. We often, like in a way, you're never going to completely solve this because we all have slightly different things that kind of trigger us.
Is it a numbers game, though? So if most actresses, for instance, find crying scenes hard, but they still want to do them to show off their skill, does that mean that the actresses who want to organize to ban crying scenes are actually just too sensitive to be actors?
Well, I don't think, maybe the problem is that they're organising to ban crying scenes when certain people are completely fine with it. Maybe the question is should they be, if there's a sizable number that find it hard, or if they are being pressured into it, then that might be the question that we should be talking about.
What would you say to the counter argument that in a lot of industries, or even in most industries, it's good that people are pressured to do things that are difficult, including crying if you're an actress, including having sex if you're a porn star, including working your fingers to the bone if you're a musician and you want to play in a classical ensemble? Like, you have to make people do things that a lot of people...
Especially in arts, although, at the same time, a lot of the time in the arts, you get this kind of expectation for people to go up and over beyond in ways that you wouldn't in other jobs, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So you're much more likely to expect someone working in the arts to do overtime that's unpaid in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect your cleaner to do.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't make any sense if someone said in a classical music world setting, why should I have to practice for 8 to 10 hours a day on my piano? The response from all the other musicians is, well, we don't like that either, but we're doing that because we want to be the best. And we don't want to have an industry where we're not incentivized to be the best, even though it would be easier for people like you who only want to practice 2 or 3 hours a day.
But it does really depend on what it is that's being talked about. Because I think you can end up being, especially in arts, you can end up being kind of pushed more and more to do things that actually maybe they're, because it's assumed that you want to do them.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're a rock star, you're pressured into putting your hearing in harm's way by doing big concerts where people are screaming at you. But on the other hand, if you only perform in a quiet room where there's only you and other musicians and you've all got earplugs on, there's a sense in which you're not really being a rock star.
So I understand the way in which, like, to achieve a particular job, you have to do certain things that may be difficult or time-consuming or hard. But what I would say is that if you're being pressured, for example, to do, there are certain points where that just seems like you're just being pressured to do extra work for no money, for example. And yes, or you're accepting greater surveillance of your private life, then maybe you should be thinking about, how do you organize against this?
Mm-hmm.
And that can happen in the arts, for example.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about it, most of the art industries are industries where people willingly take on obligations to do things that no human would pressure another human to do. Like if a human said to his partner, you have to practice the piano 8 to 10 hours a day, that would be considered almost like abuse. Mm-hmm. Or you have to go stand in front of a bunch of people screaming at you with earplugs on and hoping it won't harm your hearing. That would be considered abuse. Or you have to perform a sex act on someone whose sex you're not attracted to. That would be abuse. But in all these capitalist industries, those things are all obligations that, because of the market, people willingly take on.
I suppose one thought experiment you can ask is, if it were not merely for the market and you just wanted to do a good job, would these things still be needed? So maybe crying in a film might still be needed in some respects.
Yeah. But, like it or not, though, getting a lot of money and being in high demand in an industry is a sign, at least in many industries, that you are highly skilled.
Mm-hmm.
And showing off that you're highly skilled means doing a lot of things that the market in that industry pressures you to do that you would never do because of the pressures of a single individual. You would even consider pressures from that individual abusive, like intense practicing or crying on cue or whatever it might be.
Well, yeah. Actually, this is the interesting thing is like a lot of I was in a film called Plot Points. It's not being finished yet.
Mm-hmm.
But we spent about a couple of days just putting Vicks underneath our eyes just so that we cry, because we had to be basically crying for nearly the whole of the film.
Mm-hmm.
Every shot was a crying scene. So we just had Vicks underneath our eyes and streaming with tears all the time, every shot. That wasn't a paid job, so it wasn't for the market at all, but it was nonetheless a challenging thing.
Mm-hmm.
I kept getting it slightly wrong and sticking it right in my eye, which was a bit...
Oh, yeah, there's all kinds of injuries that people have because of makeup that goes bad in horror movies.
But yeah, no, this was just Vicks, which is, the cough rub, the stuff you stick on your chest
mm-hmm.
when you're cold to clear your throat. But it does make you cry.
Yeah. Well, I guess the question is, when do you have an obligation to work within a system, to do your best within the constraints of the system or get out, versus when do you have a good reason to try and change a system?
I think some of it's partly intuitive,
mm-hmm.
and sometimes it involves a bit of conversation, because sometimes certain things that seem really unreasonable might turn out to be not so unreasonable once you've seen that person's perspective. Or vice versa, something might seem quite reasonable and then you realize it's not. But it does require, discussion.
One of the things that you've written about is a piece that you wrote that was in Culture on the Offensive called Fuck Off,
mm-hmm.
where you described how somebody was sort of quasi-harassing you when you were wearing genderqueer clothing. Mm-hmm. And the piece sort of suggests that you would rather be in a situation where, rather than change the situation in which you would encounter a man like that, you'd rather rely on your own agency and tell that man fuck off. Which sort of seems that you were advocating a variation on, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen.
I don't know if I was. I also think that it's also suggesting if you can't stand the heat, actually make some radical change about it, rather than trying to create some kind of form of acceptance. I think that is going on there as well. It's a critique, I think, a largely critique of acceptance, but it is certainly saying that there's an importance of just saying fuck off in those contexts where you cannot and do not know, where you can't completely change things, rather than say accept me. There's certain people and certain times where you should just say fuck off.
Well, is there a difference between telling someone who's harassing you fuck off and trying to create a new social norm whereby the social norms pressure the harasser so heavily that you don't have to worry about being harassed in that way, because they're actually taking a bigger risk in harassing you than you would be in wearing the unusual clothing?
There are those things. I think what I was looking mostly at in that piece was the way that sort of counterculture did it by saying you either accept me or fuck off. But by doing that, they started to create a new culture. Whereas I felt like there's certain times where, certainly, and this was written in 2015, so it's a little while back.
Mm-hmm.
But I was the emerging kind of the Twitter culture seemed like it wasn't quite doing that. It was doing simply change the norm or accept me without the or fuck off. And it seemed like fuck off was a kind of powerful thing because it allowed you to say, I'm going to start creating this new culture, rather than I'm going to be dependent on you, the system that's already in place for my validation.
What would you say to your critic who says the appropriate thing to do is not for the genderqueer person to feel like they ever have to say fuck off? The appropriate thing to do is for everybody else to finger wag at the bullies, so the bullies know that everybody else is going to take them down if they ever bully the genderqueer person.
I think that's a slightly different context from what I was talking about. On the whole, I don't think, so my worry with that position would be that are you actually persuading the bully, or are you changing that person's mind in some ways, or are you pushing that culture underground? That was, I think, something that kind of gets raised in there, in that piece.
Interesting. So what that seems to suggest is that in order to erase a bullying culture that persecutes a minority, that minority has to have the responsibilities to stand up for themselves. If everybody stands up on behalf of the minority, the anti-minority culture never really goes away. It just becomes suppressed.
Well, stand up for yourself can mean collective organisation and struggles. But I imagine those struggles being much more like movements from the sort of civil rights struggles, right through to things like ACT UP, rather than being ways in which you can mobilise collective action, and or the way in which counterculture kind of creates a new vision for a society. So I don't think those are ones which don't challenge the person perpetrating an action. What I was trying to do is just say there's a certain importance of not just looking to, say, your employer to be more accepting or to have new policies around inclusion. So one of the problems with something like human resources, which it does use kind of often LGBT inclusive language, it can start to have diversity policies, all sorts of things like this, but it does so in a way to protect the boss, to make the boss look kind of good, to manage disputes so there's not too many disputes within the workplace. So what you think might be so-called liberation in that context really makes you dependent on a particular system. And so the call for more inclusion can sometimes be a way of becoming more dependent within that system rather than saying, and I think there is an importance of having your own agency to say fuck off when it needs to be done. Or ways of mobilizing against people in a way that's not simply, I need acceptance from you.
So it's still sort of giving the victim some responsibility.
I think, yeah. I mean, it's not, I don't want a kind of victim mentality that's just passive. I think there's a way of, it's more of an active position, I guess.
What would you say to the critic who says the victim position has to be passive or else it's victim blaming?
That's not very empowering for you. As a victim, when you're a victim of something, do you simply want to be passive and then kind of become part of a political system which may be actually oppressing you just because it seems to be more accepting?
Well, they would say it's society's job to allow you to be passive, and society should sort of clean up the mess for you because you're the victim.
That seems very disempowering, and that sounds very, in a way, conservative, because it implies that you remain complicit within that particular system.
Interesting. Well, this has been another really fascinating conversation. I'd love to continue this. I could talk to you for hours, but unfortunately, I have a really bad toothache.
Oh, God.
So I've got to put some ice on my face right now. But it was a really lovely second podcast that I will cut up and we will have up next Monday, if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be fine. Yeah.
That was the Culture on the Offensive podcast. This is Greg Scorzo. If you like this podcast and other material that we do at Coda Publishing, check us out at www.cultureontheoffensive.com. And if you're interested in the radio play that we just finished, Love Before COVID, based on my book, Post-Socratic Dialogues Love, there will be a link below, so stay safe, be courageous, and don't forget to go outside of your comfort zone. And remember, when you hear things that sound wrong or stupid or silly or strange, don't forget to use empathy, clarity, and courage.